There is no question but that Mary Magdalene was a very important person, a very important leader in the early Christian church. According to all of the Gospels, she was one of the first witnesses of the resurrection of Jesus. There is an early Gospel written in her name that claims to contain teachings that were passed down exclusively from Jesus directly to Mary. Churches were founded in her name. She was a very important person, and yet despite that, we are actually told very little about her in the Gospels. And in fact, we only have 3 pieces of information, biographical information, about this woman in the Bible. We are told, first of all, her name, which seems to indicate that she comes from the town of Magdala in Galilee, a place that we actually know a few things about. In our reading this morning, we are told that she had 7 demons, a rather disturbing detail. And we are also told that she was there on Easter, one of the first to encounter the risen Jesus. That's it. That's very little for such an important figure. And that's always left me pondering and wondering, well, who was this Mary? What can we really know about her? And so this September, I decided to focus in on Mary Magdalene to see what she had to teach us. Last week, I spent some time looking at Mary's origins in Magdala and what that can tell us about her. In a couple of weeks, I'll look at her presence at Jesus' tomb. But today, I want to focus in on this rather disturbing idea that she had 7 demons. 7 demons. Now, this little tidbit of information comes to us from a short passage in the Gospel of Luke. A very significant passage, of course. Because you see, the other Gospels tell us that Jesus had many disciples, but only talks about the male disciples, often listing them by name. This has led many to conclude down through the centuries that Jesus only had male disciples, only had male followers. This has led to doctrines, for example, in the Roman Catholic Church. But here in this passage in Luke, we find out that this is really not the case. That there were also women who followed him, who were absolutely essential to his ministry, and that the whole thing would have fallen apart without them. So the significance of these women cannot be underestimated. The very presence of such women, however, would have caused a certain scandal. In that society, in that culture, women were simply not permitted to travel alone or without a male relative from their own family. It just wasn't done. So people would have looked at the situation, a mixed group with women who were not related, and would have just assumed that something unseemly was going on. They would have assumed all kinds of lewd and indecent things. In particular, the presence of this Joanna who is mentioned, Joanna, who is identified as the wife of Chuza, the steward of Herod, probably caused a significant scandal. Because, of course, the Herod that is mentioned there is King Herod. King Herod Antipas, the king of Galilee and Perea, who would have counted Jesus among his enemies. The same Herod who had killed John the Baptist, who would kill Jesus if given the chance. And the wife of his steward is there with Jesus. We can only assume that she must have been estranged from her husband, because I cannot imagine that Herod's steward would have wanted his husband traveling around with his boss's enemy. So this kind of thing caused a tremendous problem for these women. It was much more dangerous for these women to follow Jesus than it was for the men. So we have to assume that these women must have had a very compelling reason to be there. And no one would have had a more compelling reason, I think, than Mary. For Mary, it says, had 7 demons. And thanks to Jesus, I'm assuming, they had gone out of her. Now, what does that mean? It's a very troubling idea for us, of course, because we do not speak today in terms of demon possession or possession by unclean spirits for some very, very good reasons. We have a long history in this world of chalking all kinds of physical and mental illnesses up to the presence of demons. And so diseases like epilepsy, or bipolar disorder, or schizophrenia, or depression have this long history of being blamed on the presence of demons. Falsely blamed, of course, on the presence of demons. And you cannot imagine the damage that such an accusation has done down through the centuries. As people suffering from terrible illnesses have had their situations made that much worse by being rejected and excluded from all human society because they were somehow evil. Very destructive idea. So that's one very good reason to totally reject that kind of language. But you need to understand that it was not just in such extreme cases that people in that society talked about demon possession. In fact, demon possession was often used to explain just about anything, any abnormal, unusual behavior. Is your son willful and disobedient? Sounds like demon possession to me. Does your wife not want to, does your daughter not want to marry the man you've chosen for her? Probably got a demon. Does your wife complain about the housework? Sounds like demon possession to me. Please understand me. I'm not suggesting that that kind of idea is at all acceptable. Please. I'm just saying that's how they thought. That's how they looked at these things. Any behavior that they did not understand or didn't want to understand, they chalked up to the activity of demons. So basically, when it says that Mary had 7 demons, that could mean just about anything. Anything, that is, except that she was a mild, ordinary, and remarkable woman. There must have been something about Mary. There must have been something about Mary that made people look at her and say, she's got problems. Now, I suspect that the something about Mary probably had to do with the fact that she was from Magdala. And Magdala was the center of King Herod's efforts to profit from the fish of the Sea of Galilee by basically appropriating all of the fish that were caught in the Sea of Galilee for himself and for his buddies for export for profit. Mary Magdalene, being from Magdala, watching this happen, could not have been happy. And she was outraged at what King Herod was doing to her community, doing to the fishermen that she had known all her life. And I suspect that Mary Magdalene was a strong-willed woman, and she tried to do something about it. Maybe she tried to organize the town, or organize the fishermen to resist King Herod's policies. If she tried to do something like that, I can guarantee you, people would have looked at her and said, that woman has a demon. Now, we might look at someone like that and say, oh, well, that's an activist. Maybe she's a bit naive, but she's trying to do something. We might admire her. But people like that scared people back then. They didn't understand them, didn't know what to do with them, and so the accusation of demon probably stuck on Mary Magdalene. So she tried to change the world for the better, and she failed. Of course she failed. She was a frustrated activist. And when she failed, I expect the Spirit went out of her. Maybe she fell into despair. Maybe she fell into depression, but she fell into a state that the people around her looked at and said, that's even worse. Maybe she refused to eat. Maybe she refused to be married. An unpardonable sin for a woman in that age. Maybe she became disruptive, but whatever it was, people looked at her and said, she's getting worse, and they said, that's another demon, and another demon, until the story that went around was that Mary had 7 demons. I think that's Mary Magdalene, the backstory. And I think she was in a pretty bad state when somebody named Jesus came along and set her free from it. Jesus told a story, and I find this very interesting, and I don't think it's a coincidence. Jesus told a story about 7 demons on some other occasion, but he told a story. And the story basically went like this. There was a man, he said, who had 1 demon, and that demon went out of him, which is a way of saying that there was something about this guy, something that people didn't like, didn't approve of. They accused him of being a demon, of having a demon. And so he got rid of that thing, tried to get on with his life. But see, the demon came back and said, well, this life looks in order. It looks empty. It looks swept up. And so the demon, Jesus said, came back and brought 7 friends with him. So the last state of the man was worse than the first. Now obviously Jesus told that story as a parable. He wasn't talking about a literal man that he knew or anything like that. But I don't think it's a coincidence that in that story the idea of having 7 demons comes up. I expect in Jesus' time that 7 demons was a proverb, was a saying. It was something that was often said of people. In other words, Mary wasn't the only one that people said had 7 demons. Now Jesus understands this problem of 7 demons in terms of emptiness. So this man he talks about, he had something in his life that made him unusual, unacceptable to the people around him. It could have been anything. Maybe he had an unusual passion. Maybe he had a bad habit. Maybe he had some sort of compulsion that people didn't approve of. Whatever it was, this man got that thing out of his life so he could get on with his life. But the problem Jesus points out is this: he left an empty hole inside him. That thing that he got out of, it left a hole inside him. It's kind of like what happens, say, when somebody has a really bad habit. Let's say an addiction to tobacco, right? And you get rid of that addiction, you get rid of that habit. But you do not replace the hole that's left inside. You do not do anything to fulfill the need that tobacco once met, and you are left with an emptiness inside. If you get into that kind of situation, you can be more fragile, you can be more susceptible of falling back into the addiction and maybe falling into something worse. That's the kind of problem Jesus points out. And I think that's the kind of thing that Mary went through. She had tried to change the world. She had tried to do something for justice in her little corner of Galilee. And she failed. And she gave up on her dream. She gave up on her passion. The problem was it left a hole inside. Because of that hole, she fell into something worse, and despair and disorder entered her life, and people around her looked at that and said, yes, she has 7 demons. Now, we don't speak in those terms. We don't understand people's problems in those terms, and we don't for very good reasons. But that doesn't mean that there's not a good lesson for us in this story. Because the good news, of course, is that that woman, Mary Magdalene, found healing. She found meaning. She found new beginnings. And she did it because she met this man named Jesus. What did Jesus do for her? I don't think he just did some sort of exorcism. I think what he really did for her was he filled a hole inside her. She had lost meaning. She had lost purpose in life. She was adrift. She was lost. And Jesus gave her meaning. Jesus gave her a sense of purpose. Jesus said to her, "Seek first the kingdom of God, and all this other stuff will be given you as well." And that was the beginning of healing for Mary. The reality is that we all have our demons. That is to say, we all have what first-century Galileans would call demons. We all have emptiness in our lives. We all have had things that have happened to us that have left a hole inside. Have you ever had a passion? Something that you really wanted and you had to give it up? Have you ever had somebody come to you and tell you that you cannot be who you know you are made to be, that you cannot do what you know you are made to do? You ever had a bad habit? You ever had somebody come along and snuff out the spirit that was in you as if they were blowing out a candle? If you've ever had anything like that, and who hasn't? Created a hole inside you. And if you did not fill that hole with something meaningful and worthwhile, you have what maybe first century Galileans would have called a demon. But the good news is this. The man who cast out the 7 demons that were in Mary Magdalene is still in the same business. If there's any emptiness within you, there is someone who can and will fill it, if you let him. Let us take a few moments now in silent prayer.